Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're sitting. I imagine we have people in many different time zones. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club of America. Today, we're going to talk with Yousra Elbagir, Sky News Africa correspondent and the winner of the International Women's Media Foundation 2025 Courage in Journalism Award. This program is co-sponsored by the OPC and the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism at Columbia University. This is the latest segment of the OPC's How I Did It series. Yousra will talk about covering the ongoing war and genocide in Sudan, what it is like reporting on the ground in a place few international journalists have been able to access, and how her own personal story intersects with the humanitarian crisis. Born into a family of Sudanese journalists, Elbagir moved back to Khartoum in 2015 to cover underreported issues. In 2019, she reported on the Sudanese revolution while working for Channel 4 News. Since April 2023, she has chronicled the current war in Sudan, which has displaced more than 13 million people, including her own family. Before joining Sky News, Yousra was a foreign news reporter for Channel 4 News and international correspondent for Vice News Tonight on HBO, making documentary-style news films. Alexis Okeowo, a writer at The New Yorker and a OPC governor, will moderate. Please put your questions in the chat. And thank you both, Alexis and Yousra, for taking the time to speak with us today. So let's begin.
Thanks, Patty. And Yousra, thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to have you, such admirers of your work. And I wanted to start off talking about what's going on now, the latest. I mean, as Patty was mentioning, the conflict in Sudan, the genocide in Sudan, is ongoing, seems to become ever more severe, yet is still largely not in the global spotlight. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on right now and about your last trip?
I mean, things are escalating really quickly since we saw Al Fashir, the capital of North Darfur state, fall at the end of October. The Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary group fighting the army for control of the country, have made very, very serious battle gains. They've managed to capture Baba Nusa, which is a key supply town, a railway city in West Kordofan that connects the north, east, and south. And they've also managed to capture Hijlij, which is an oil-rich area just on the border with South Sudan. So they're really making serious gains. They've already got gold-rich areas in Darfur, and they have access to Libya and Chad, supply routes of weapons through there. And now they have this border area with South Sudan that is incredibly, lucrative. And they also are inching closer back to the center of Sudan. So the next stop for them, we expect, is a city called Al Ubaid, which is in North Kordofan, and it is ultimately kind of at the heart of the country. It straddles the center of Sudan, but it also straddles the southwest, Darfur and the Kordofan regions, and it is home to 500,000 people at least, because a lot of these cities become displacement sites, right? So the population is always in flux, and they have been using drone warfare. The army has been using drone warfare. And actually, 48 hours ago, a drone hit the UN peacekeeping hub in Kadugli, which is the capital of South Kordofan, and 6 UN peacekeepers were killed from Bangladesh. And we've seen these drone strikes escalate from March, when the army reclaimed Khartoum, the capital, from the Rapid Support Forces. The strategy was very quickly recalibrated. The RSF kind of pivoted to drone warfare to hit the center and the east of the country, and at the same time kind of pivoted all their resources to tighten their 18-month siege of Al Fashir. And then that eventually led to Al Fashir being starved, shelled, and captured by the RSF. So we're now 2.5 years into the war. The first year was very much about Khartoum It was about them really holding on to Khartoum after capturing it in a morning. It only took morning hours for Khartoum's airport to be captured and for the city to basically become besieged, the center of the capital, Khartoum proper. The army stayed in Durman, which is the northwest, and kind of regrouped from there. But essentially, the RSF held two-thirds of the tripartite capital. The focus was on Khartoum and reclaiming Khartoum, but also almost reckoning with the war and the fact that it wasn't just a bout of violence. It was actually a long-term conflict. Now we're 2.5 years in. We're looking at a potential split. We're looking at Sudan being carved out, like Libya, like Yemen, where the RSF and their allies, the rebel groups that have aligned to them, will have all of Darfur, which is what they managed to do by capturing Al-Fashir. It was the last state capital in Darfur that they managed to claim. And then now the southwest region in the Kordofan states. So it's really scary to look at the map right now and see that the country is going to be split in two. Darfur is already a region the size of France. And then when you add the Kordofan states, it's a huge chunk. And this is what, 14 years after the South Sudan seceded. So it's crazy to think that in my lifetime, I've seen my country potentially become three.
I mean, it's wild to think about. It's wild to think about. And um, it's interesting because when we were talking about this event before, we had used the term civil war, but you were like, actually, that's actually not right. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, I have a lot of understanding for using civil war because it is, it's kind of a very, it makes sense, right? It's a militia rebelling against the military state. But I think there's a lot of contention around it being called a civil war because civilians did not incite this war. So that's one of the kind of big contentions around calling it a civil war. The second thing is the huge foreign influence on the war, right? The fact that the UAE is credibly accused of backing the Rapid Support Forces militarily, and our reporting at Sky News has backed up those allegations, and that they are using the RSF to gain access to the Red Sea. That was one of their key goals, to gain access to gold mines, to gain access to now oil fields. So the contention with the term civil war is because of how little civilians actually have to do with the war. And a
Oh,
lot of the civilian recruitment that came with the war was very much a lot of young men feeling like this is the only way that they can get their homes back because Khartoum is like a capital city of 7 million people. And civilian young men recruits led the charge in reclaiming the capital from the RSF. It's not the tribalism that exists in Sudan that created the foundation for this war does still not account for the level and scale of the violence. If Egypt and Saudi and Turkey and Qatar and Iran weren't backing the army, that they would have been encouraged to go to the mediation table. If the UAE wasn't backing the RSF would not have ever made this much headway. So it's really difficult because I don't think it's a proxy war because there are seeds of conflict. There was a conflict 20 years ago. There is that capacity. The RSF would commit these atrocities in any case, but it's also the scale of it is so much to do with outside influence. And one of the main kind of terms that I feel comfortable with that, I mean, it serves as analysis rather than in a headline. So it's understandable it's not used as often is counter-revolutionary war because the hijacking of the revolution, the usurping of the revolution made this war so beneficial for both armed factions, but particularly the military state. They had lost popularity. They saw people go out in millions, denouncing military rule, wanting civilian rule, and now they are a necessary, uh, necessary evil, definitely lesser evil, I would say. So, yeah, counter-revolutionary war, but ultimately just a horrible, brutal war is taking place.
Right, right. And, obviously you have reported on Sudan for at least a decade, but this particular conflict, access has been, incredibly difficult for a lot of journalists who are based outside the country, including yourself. How have you managed? Can you tell us more about how you managed to get access, what it's like working with your team on the ground, and also how you managed to tell stories within an incredibly complex, environment. It's a complex story. Um, and yeah, it's sort of how you go about access and storytelling on the ground.
It's interesting because I was looking back on the first trip, and because I was on a mission to get my parents out, I leveraged every single contact I had. But it still was a matter of the airspace is closed. How do we get there? Once we started with going to Djibouti to cover the foreign nationals of being evacuated. And then our Middle East editor at the time, he's now an international editor, Zain Jaffer, got us into Saudi to cover the naval vessels that were bringing evacuees to Jeddah. So we were just inching closer, and every flight we didn't know if we were actually going to get in. When we got to Saudi, uh, it was nuts because I was reporting live on this naval vessel, and I'm interviewing this Peruvian family. The father's an aid worker who lived in Khartoum, and I feel eyes on me, and I turn and I see my uncle, and run over, hug him live on air. Just so ecstatic to see him. I didn't know that he'd managed to get out, and it was surreal. I then go straight from the port to the embassy to try and get the team visas. We managed to get on a commercial ferry. And when we faced some difficulty about going to Sudan as a team of journalists, the border official came on the ship and he asked me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I need to go. My family are in there. I need to get in." And he said, "I saw the video with your uncle. Go ahead, do what you want to do." And so it was the first trip for me, I think really encapsulated how much we have to rely on those like human moments, but also the kind people along the way who push us through, who get us through. Every trip since has been similarly not as difficult and not as consequential, but very much getting the visas is only the first step. You get there, there are people at the airport that stop you, you don't have the right paperwork, you have to call someone, you go to the next place, you don't have access to this hospital, you have to convince them that what you're doing is actually to the benefit of civilians and the people in the country. And so I say every time I go to Sudan, it feels like a pilgrimage, and it really does. It feels like every notion I have of what I'm capable of doing is being challenged, but it's ultimately leaning on the team I've come with and convincing people that we're there for the right reasons and that I've managed to get some of the best media professionals in the world here to tell the story, like help us. And I always kind of used to position my cameraman. I'm like, this guy has been to Iraq, he's been to Syria, he's been to Libya, he covered the fall of Gaddafi. And they all just are like, okay, you guys aren't playing around. It's been like that every time. When we got into North Darfur in September, just this September, weeks before Al-Fashir fell, it took 2 years. It took 2 years of going to different borders, meeting border officials, Chadian side, building trust on the Sudanese side in Port Sudan, really having to convince people from so many different groups, whether it's humanitarian aid workers, government officials, just that we're delivering something that doesn't really have an agenda. We're not here with any nefarious intention. And when we did get in, it was nuts because we met people who hadn't been interviewed, who hadn't spoken to anyone, who were just kind of feeling like they were cut off, like just cut off, relegated to the sidelines. And you go into the camps and you see people and you're like, that 2 years of convincing, of talking, of waiting, it was 100% worth it. And I think every trip feels that way, whether we're going into Khartoum for the first time or we're going to an area with a cholera outbreak or we're going to Darfur, it really feels like I'm in a position where I can I know a lot of people who can help, but I'm also meeting people every trip
Yeah.
who can vouch for us.
Mm.
And leveraging that is really important. And I think that's what we've tried to do over the last 2.5 years. And thankfully now I feel like we don't have to convince people as much as we used to, but I still remember that first trip and how much I had to rely on like the goodwill of
Hmm.
strangers.
Yeah. And it's yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that because I think that's true. I think a lot of journalists have can relate to that. And do you feel like because obviously you have the personal connection, the familial connection to Sudan, has that helped? Has that hurt in any ways? How has that affected?
It, it's definitely a mixed bag. I think there's an assumption that it's easier. And I think in some ways, logistically,
Right. Right.
language, it's easier. I think that I'm often up against this uh, assumption that I am not neutral because I'm Sudanese, that I have to pick a side because I'm Sudanese. I think there's also just the charge, right? The fact that when I'm going, I'm dealing with the fact that I'm not just covering a random war. Like I'm covering the future of my country. I'm covering, my whether I'm being asked by my parents, can we go back? Is it safe? And I'm assessing on the ground. Is this now a place that I would advise anyone I love to return to? I think it's been great for me because I've learned so much about myself. I've feel like I've grown as a person, and I've also I think one thing that's been really important is that it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all like despair. It is, I've met incredible people who have so much courage, who have, against the odds, managed to keep faith. And, we try and cover as many human moments as we can and try and cover the war through these vignettes, these stories of families. And I mean, some of the things that we've seen has just, I don't think I could have written a script, a movie script that would have been as moving or as inspiring. And I think that for me makes it worth the ordeal of going back every time.
Mm. Yeah, because I was going to ask you, I wonder if you think about the international misconceptions of Sudan as you're reporting, and um, it sounds like, whether intentionally or not, you do when you're capturing these narratives, the other side of the doom and gloom in your stories.
Yeah, I think we make choices. We make editorial choices that I don't know if I would have that I would have made if I had not grown up kind of seeing the tropes. So when we covered the famine initially, we didn't ever film starving children. We filmed farmers who fed the country, now
Mhm.
relying on handouts. And the idea for it was like the Ethiopia famine, the idea that farmers in some of the most arable land on the African continent are starving shows how man-made famine is. It was, I think it was always just kind of the trying to get that third dimension, trying to see it beyond just victims.
Mhm.
Um, but that actually it's debilitating because these are the most kind of active and generous people that in our economy, in our country. So it's I try not to be too subversive because I'm like you kind of have to take it all. But
Mhm.
but I definitely feel like I have completely tried to apply that to covering Africa in general
Mhm.
and not just kind of feeding into kind of those sexy headlines of what sounds good and but actually try and flesh it out in a way that is honest and respectful and ultimately can nurture some compassion beyond like a fleeting sympathy vote, but actually no, this is a nation with a history, with people who are agents, and they are being impinged upon, inflicted upon, but that doesn't change the fullness of their lives and their experiences.
Mhm. Absolutely. And, zooming out for a bit, I wondered your thoughts on coverage of Sudan in general and your thoughts on if journalists are able to play any role in sort of how this crisis, I mean, not just perceived, obviously, but also um, the international community's response to it, the actors within it. Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on.
So I tend to find that I feel like Sudan benefits from really great journalists in different outlets that are committed to Sudan.
Mm,
And so I don't necessarily see it as a completely underreported or forgotten war. I
mhm,
do think that there's a lack of sustained coverage. So, I mean, Declan Walsh from the New York Times covers it consistently. Jazeera journalists generally cover it consistently. Hiba Morgan is on the ground for Jazeera English. Matt Nashid writes for Jazeera. Guardian cover it. Mark Townsend, Mohamed Hashim. Like there's kind of a cabal of committed, journalists who are committed to covering Sudan with all the twists and turns.
mhm,
It's exhausting. And I understand that, newsroom editors are not necessarily going to deploy to Sudan twice a year. I'm very lucky that at Sky, um, they deploy twice a year. They deploy us 3, 4 times a year to Sudan. But I also I think that what the coverage could benefit from is that on-ground access. Are those interviews, are like the voices of the people on the ground reaching as opposed to, you know, quotes over the phone. I think that's important to again sustain the coverage, but just being there, feeling it, sharing it is so key. And that's why when journalists do reach out to me and they want to get in, I really try and figure it out with them because I'm like, the more people who go, the better. I
mm,
mean, there was a journalist for a Dutch newspaper, and he did this really beautiful thing where he went to the National Theatre in Omdurman, and one of these amazing Sudanese musicians. I mean, I'll send you the link, but generally, I wish I could just have it at hand to share. But he had him playing the violin in the National Theatre, and it was all kind of, bullet ridden and crumbling, and a war impacted and battered National Theatre. But he was just playing the violin so beautifully in the theatre. And he had been displaced by the war, had lost loved ones to the war, the musician. And just that kind of vignette. I said, I wish we had more coverage of Sudan like that. That is just
mm.
moving. That is art. That is has depth, not just they've been victimized by the war and the international community didn't help them, you know?
Right. But where these voices were more present and people were, as a result, thinking about them more often, I
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah, I think like, do you remember the photo of Ala Salah on the car in the revolution? Like those really moving moments. And for us, I think that we are trying to just generate as much as we can that can help and that can further awareness and understanding of Sudan. But ultimately, we are tracking as I think we are trying to track those moments, whether it's a breaking news moment with the military advancements, or it is a moment on the ground with someone in an IDP camp who's a volunteer who's helping thousands of people and is breaking down. I mean, those are the moments that we hope will break through the firewall.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I think we just need more human reporting from
yeah,
Sudan for sure.
makes sense. Before I ask my next question, I just want to remind people they can put their questions in the chat box. Um, you know, I wondered, um, as you're continuing the story, as you're talking about this possible likelihood of further fracture in the country. Is there anything, I mean, what gives you hope while you're reporting? What kind of, is there anything that sort of makes you feel a bit optimistic about how things may go or?
I think I have faith in the people of Sudan, in the humanity of Sudan, and I think I really try and pull back from the helplessness and the feeling of like no one's gonna come save us, you know? We were warning, everyone's
Yeah.
warning, but no one's gonna step in. And I think the reality is that the people on the ground have surrendered to that. They surrendered to that a long time ago. The
Yeah.
community kitchens, the mutual aid, the constant fundraising, but also like even just being on the ground and seeing all these makeshift displacement shelters completely relying on mutual aid. We would drive past trucks, UN trucks that were just sitting in the sun full of food, and then there's a displacement shelter right next to it. But because, they're trying to get into famine zones that are very difficult to get into, but meanwhile, there are people just next door having to grow their own food who are displaced. So, I mean, I think I've lost faith in the international system
Sure.
for sure, but I've also increased my faith, increased my confidence, I would say, in community efforts, in grassroots volunteering. I think, the ERRs, emergency response rooms that were born out of the revolution, who've been nominated twice for Nobel Peace Prize, are feeding 3 million people. That's
Yeah.
completely mutual aid, focused. And so when I do start to be like, oh, the futility of it all, I'm just like, no, because they're, the strength, the generosity, the compassion, the care, everything I've loved about Sudan is
Mm.
saving Sudan right now. And we've seen it. Every time we go, we see it. I think what frustrates me is the fact that they're carrying the sky, by themselves ultimately. And I can feel the pressure, and I can feel how physically draining and it is on young people who are displaced themselves. I mean, we covered volunteers food smuggling coordinators. Like, these guys are volunteers who set up food smuggling coordination to get life-saving medicine and food into Al Fashir. And we met them in this like dark storeroom, and they spoke to us in secret, and they basically raise funds from abroad, organize groups going out. And these guys were getting caught by the RSF on the way. So the week that we met them, they'd lost 30 volunteers. And they were smuggling in, they were getting flour from Libya, from Chad, sending it through. And they would go by cart, by foot, first car, then cart, then by foot as they get closer to Al Fashir. And then they'd bury the supplies and then send GPS coordinates to volunteers in Al Fashir. That's predominantly how people in Al Fashir were surviving in the last few months of the siege. And just meeting people like that, you're just like,
Mm. This is
wow,
zero. Yeah,
this is
impressive.
where, yeah, this is where hope lives. This is the
Okay.
only place we can put our hope. They should not have to do this, but
Yeah,
and they are.
yeah, yeah. No, that's very moving. Um, and then how do you feel about the sort of the international aspect? As you've talked about, um, there are other countries severely influencing and benefiting from this war. Have you seen any sort of accountability? Is there any movement you're seeing within the international community as far as to not only these two military actors within the country, but with also the actors that are supporting them and financing?
So the UK has just issued a raft of sanctions against 4 RSF commanders, including the deputy commander Abdurrahim Dagalo, who's the brother of the RSF leader Hemeti. They said that they're doing this in the wake of Al Fashir and the documented atrocities in Al Fashir. You know, our question to them is, why have you not sanctioned the leader of the RSF,
Mhm.
Hemeti? Why is the UAE not mentioned in this statement or in any way? And I think the reality is that all of these mechanisms are way, way too late. Like, you're going to sanction them after they built an empire, after, you watch them hijack a revolution, come into the capital, create businesses. I mean, it's tough because we're not looking at crisis prevention, right? We're looking at post-mortem, like almost like saving face. And the UK is accused of protecting the UAE from any accountability. They're accused of, you know, shifting votes that could affect the UAE in the Security Council. They're accused of removing genocide from reports. They've chosen to essentially coddle the UAE as an ally, and they're not alone. We've seen that across Europe. I've spoken to policymakers in Europe who've told me point blank, we're not going to pressure the UAE diplomatically in that way, who will not stop selling arms to the UAE. The UK, the US, Germany are all some of the biggest sellers of arms to the UAE. So in the sense of, do I believe anyone's going to do anything about it? No, because the UAE is a lucrative, powerful, and efficient ally to have at this time. The UAE is investing in ports across Europe. They're just throwing money at all of these countries that are dealing with economic crises in the West. And I mean, the US peace talks are not going well at all.
Mm.
Uh, just 2 days before Al-Fashir fell to the RSF, there was talks of potentially there being a signing, a ceasefire agreement, and reportedly the UAE intervened to block Al-Fashir from being included in the ceasefire agreement because it's a militarized zone in their eyes. But Maz'ad Bullis, the U.S. envoy for the Middle East and Africa, is seen to be um, working in the interests of the UAE. And we expected that when Mohammed bin Salman met with Trump, that there would be movement and there was more of kind of, I would say, more initiative from President Trump at that time. But I think we've been told that Saudi and the UAE are still, they're refusing, they're ultimately tiptoeing around each other. They have conflicting interests in Sudan. They're tiptoeing around each other so that they don't actually go head to head. But I think that there's a lot of concern from Saudi Arabia that the UAE will get access to the Red Sea. The Red Sea is a red line for Saudi. And we've also been told that it's no coincidence that the UAE has now, after MBS's meeting with Trump, has essentially, reignited its efforts in southern Yemen. So there's so many dynamics involved. We also can't forget Libya. The
Yeah.
fact that Haftar's Libya is essentially a corridor for arms into Darfur for the RSF via the UAE. We've seen, equipment that Haftar is, the LNA, the Libyan National Army, are using in southwest Libya. And then we see the same thing being used by the RSF. So the dynamics are sprawling. Neighboring countries like Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, as well as Chad and Libya, are accused of being, funneling arms. And also Egypt is obviously benefiting massively from this war. They are, you know, working with the army to both legitimately and illegitimately smuggle gold out of the country. They have put excessive border restrictions on Sudanese people going into Egypt, even though there was free border movement for men over the age of 50 and under the age of 13, and women. Before, we had a kind of free border agreement that ended, I would say, less than 2 months into the war. Um, I think the reality is that this is a sprawling security crisis that is going to have huge spillover, not just in Africa, but also into Europe, right? And I think the approach that European policymakers, are taking now to kind of focus on the far right, the rising far right, and winning over votes and focusing on nationalizing their budgets is so fundamentally short-sighted, because there's no way that a security crisis this big won't land on their door. It's impossible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in your reporting, do you think about what it would sort of take in order to push for something more meaningful than these sort of ongoing failing peace talks, this pretend accountability for, the UAE and Saudi? I mean, I just was curious.
I think with Al-Fashir falling and the kind of the shock and horror of everything that, you know, human rights monitors, activists, everything that everyone was warning about happened, you
Yeah.
know, the massacres. And I think the fact you can see the blood from space and the corpses from space is a nuts thing. Like, how much blood needs to be shed for you to see it from space? And the reality is that I think after Al-Fashir, the fact that we almost knew, because a group of us were all talking, journalists, investigators, all of us kind of either reporting on Sudan, from Darfur, from Khartoum. And we all said, is this going to last? And we all knew that it would not be sustained, that eventually there'd be all this shock and that everyone would move on. And we've seen that with Gaza, we've seen that with a lot of other conflicts. But I think fundamentally, I think that's what policymakers bank on, that people will just get distracted by the next thing. So I, at this point, don't believe that anything that we report or share will change the fact that this is an incredibly inconvenient war to
Mm.
deal with at this time with these backers. I just don't think that Europe or the West is going to turn around and decide that they want to foster goodwill and bring back multilateralism and all this stuff at a time where it's all actively being phased out.
Yeah, fair. Fair. And this reporting on this conflict, reporting on the genocide as well, would be difficult, I think, for any journalist. I mean, the emotional toll it takes, reporting, talking to people in these devastating environments. But of course, you have this kind of a bit of an insider-outsider status, right? You have this family connection. You're also an international journalist. How do you manage the toll that this reporting takes as you continue to dive deeper into it?
I benefit from a really great support system. And it's
Mhm.
not just, peer support, it's mentorship. It's,
Mhm.
a core team that when we go into a place, I know that they care as much as I do when they meet people and they hear these stories and they are moved. And so, we go into Sudan and we come out and we have 3 edits ahead of us. And I can feel all of them are like, this has to be done really well. We have to do this justice because they have seen the reality on the ground and they understand how important it is for this to represent the gravity and the scale and the intensity of what's happening to people. So that it gives me a lot of it gives me a sense of purpose. I feel very, I guess, like you said, I have a very privileged position. I'm both from Sudan, but I also have this access to resources, outside of Sudan. And I also can leave. And I think that one of the things that was important for me from, it changes. The first year I'd leave and I'd feel a lot of guilt. I'd feel survivor's guilt. I'd feel like I needed to, you know, f spend every waking moment figuring out how to stop this war. And I think
Mm.
as time has gone on, I realized that I am not capable
Right.
of stopping this war. No one is, but it's incredibly humbling because you realize that you're doing it and you can't expect that it's going to have any outcome beyond the fact that it is now on the record, that it is being documented and archived and can never be denied. Like
Yeah.
that's really now the baseline that I go for of like, their testimony is being shared. We were able to see such a pivotal moment just before Al-Fashir fell in a state where people were holding on for dear life. And that's staying with me. As I report on Al-Fashir falling, or as I look back on the year in Sudan, or as I speak to you now, I'm using that knowledge and like that experience that I had on the ground with people. So it helps me a lot to, I guess, really just accept, kind of accept the things that I can't change, and at the same time do as much as I can to contribute. And I also, again, I really don't take it for granted that I have the support and the opportunity that I have to do this at this time. I mean, I could have been freelance and not been able to go into Sudan, and I've been freelance for most of my career. So to
Mm.
be, working at an organization that one, want to invest in Sudan, and two, want to, you know, make it news, not just take the lead, but actually we are going to make it news. I think that's been that's been the point where I'm like, okay, I'm exactly where I need to be doing what I need to do with really talented people, and so that's, and it's not like you don't have the bad days where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm writing about Sudan again and it's worse this time. It's horrible. Like it's the baseline is pretty tough, right? But it's also the fact that it could be happening and I could not be able to do anything about it. I could be completely paralyzed and I'm not. And that is in and of itself a very important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way you put it. It's important just to have this reporting on the record, as part of the archive that this happened. Even if, as journalists, we can't control what kind of effect, if any effect it will have, that in itself is extremely important. Um, and I wonder, as you're thinking now, well, I'm curious what you're thinking now about your work, your career. I mean, obviously you cover a variety of stories, but as we're going into the new year, how are you thinking about what you want to focus your work on, what kind of stories you want to tell?
So I'm heading to Jerusalem tomorrow. So
Okay.
I'm gonna do Middle East cover for Christmas, and then I'm gonna come back. And there's already a series of things that we want to do in Africa. And a key thing is that I really want to do this thing on a more kind of micro level. So throughout my career, I spend time in Sudan, train in Sudan, and then I leave and I'm in London and I'm like getting training and then I get resources and I go back. And now I think it's this kind of thing in the bureau where it's like, yeah, we go to Sudan and we come out and then we spend time doing other stories and then we go to Sudan. And I think it's really good for me to just be able to not only step out, but to apply and what I've learned in Sudan in other places and vice versa, right? Because it's such a huge continent and it's so rich and it's so diverse. And I'm based in South Africa, but I go to Lesotho and I go to, any place in Southern Africa and it's completely different. And I need that. And I think that's really what I want to make sure I do more of next year. I mean, we started this year in the DRC in Goma as it was being captured by M23, and I want to follow up on the story in the DRC. I want to find out what's happening in Goma and in Eastern DRC in general. We want to go to Ghana for stories. There's a lot to do, and I think rather than it being pulled out of Sudan and the news kind of forcing me out, I want to actively
Yeah.
create that balance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because you mentioned you spent actually, you said a lot of your career freelance, and then you got into, can you talk about that a little bit?
So I moved back to Sudan when I graduated, and I was freelance for the first 2 years full when I was full time. And when I moved back to Sudan, it was really about for me, features, right? I was pitching feature after feature because Sudan had been very much like Darfur conflict, al-Bashir's, South Sudan secession, al-Bashir's dictatorship. And I think once the South seceded and al-Bashir had a rigged election, it was kind of like everyone's like, oh, we know how this story goes. It's just another kind of doomed dictatorship. And so when I moved back, it was so much about reporting on really cool like community initiatives, like people training Sudanese volunteers training sniffer dogs to find old World War II landmines, or artists in Sudan, this like cultural renaissance of underground artists becoming more and more open after such a repressive period for the art. So I was doing all this stuff and I feel like it really kind of set the tone for everything I do now, which is like where's the fullness? How do we kind of flesh it out? What's under kind of the top line? But I did that and then I moved back to the UK and I started doing documentaries with Channel 4 and it was freelance. And then I worked with Vice News Tonight and I just felt like I needed to be freelance again and I needed to move back to Sudan. And I moved back in November 2018 and December 2018 the revolution started. So
Mm.
I was freelance initially, and then I was with Channel 4 News.
Hmm.
Um, and then I left Channel 4 News and I was freelancing again, and then I went to Sky.
And then you went to Sky. Okay. Okay. So yeah, it sounds like you were able to see sort of, I imagine you gained a lot of skills through freelancing, being able to sort of hustle and look for the stories that served you, um, being staff now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I just want to check if there are any questions from the audience, uh, before before we let user go. Oh, sorry, I didn't see these. Um, we have a question from Chantel. As someone who has been covering the war in Sudan for 2 years, how do you think anti-Blackness and colorism play in the role of the war?
I mean, I think it's very much a stereotype for African countries to deal with conflict. Like it's anti-black in the sense that it is seen to be like a fundamental part of the African story to deal with civil war and conflict. And I think that's something that we've been really working to, I'd say, dismantle, like this fatalism,
Mm.
um, that I think is ultimately racism, right? Because the revolution was a break in that story for Sudan. It was agency, it was democracy, it was so inspiring and beautiful, and it was brutal. The crackdown was nuts. Hundreds of young people lost their lives. But I think that's where we really, a lot of us, as a lot of the journalists who are into Sudan right now, were started getting into Sudan because of the revolution. And that for me was like, okay, this war it wasn't inevitable. It actually was going to, if it was an inevitable part of our story because of 20 years ago in Darfur, the revolution had the capacity to take us on a different track. And it was actively suppressed. And so I definitely feel like we just we don't get to have long histories. And I think that that is very much a discriminatory thing. It's not like people don't look at the war in Sudan the same way they would look at, World War II or any of these kind of glorified wars. They look at it as oh, the Africans are fighting again. And so I
Right.
definitely have been, really working with that. And it's across the continent, but it's across the global south. I mean, I think Yemen, it doesn't get any proper coverage anymore. Um, and so, yeah, so that's one of the main ways that I've dealt with, I'd say, anti-Blackness. Colorism, I think we have internally dealt with colorism in Sudan, and that's the kind of tribalism and the Arab supremacy that we see the RSF
Yes.
wielding and using against people, and sort of the way that they target people, civilians based on ethnicity in their massacres. So it's not just an external colorism and racism, it's also our internal colorism
Yeah.
and racism that's been huge. And it also, I think, for me, was a big part of how we covered the war. So I didn't, I'm from Khartoum, but it was very much like trip to Khartoum or to Sudan, like central Sudan, then trip to Chad to cover the people leaving Darfur. And it always felt to me like it's not that this shouldn't even have to be an effort. This is how the war should be covered. But I do feel like the pitfalls of covering Sudan through a very narrow perspective, which is just the kind of Arabized elite in Khartoum, is such a risk, and we've seen it before. And so I definitely wanted to make sure our coverage reflected the country. So that
Yeah.
was where we did a lot of internal travel, and that was where kind of getting into Darfur was so seminal when we finally got to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge because, yeah, not many people have been able to do it. They're covering it from Chad, as you said. Um, and another question, Nick, hi, I have a question. I was in the Nuba Mountains a year ago. No one there thought that they would be part of an integrated Sudan again. Is there a way that that country stays together?
I think that the Nuba Mountains is still very much the rebellion there is so old and deep rooted that I don't see a track where the SPLM, the Sudanese people, the Sudan People Liberation Movement North. Sorry, there's so many, there's so
Right.
many groups. But SPLM-N, led by Abdelaziz Al-Hulu, they control large parts of South Kordofan, right? And they have been dealing with counterinsurgency campaigns and bombings from Khartoum since 2013, basically since the South seceded and they were kind of left lumped with the North.
Mhm.
I think with Al Hilo, I mean, the rebel leader in that region has decided to partner up with the RSF, even though the RSF was pillaging and attacking cities in South Kordofan. And the reason he did that is because his contention and his roots of, you know, they've been marginalized by the centralized state for so long that he would rather deal with the RSF than join up with the government. So he had talks with both and eventually chose the RSF predominantly for supply, weapon supply, but also because the RSF kind of work on that narrative that they are going to bring together all the marginalized groups in Sudan. They're the Arabs, the nomadic Arabs of Darfur who never got a stake to the land, and they were used by al-Bashir to uphold the state, but they were never actually given anything. That's why they felt the right to loot all of those homes in Khartoum. But the reality is they loot homes everywhere, you know. But this narrative that um, I think a big part of what I've been thinking is what makes a rebel, right? Because the RSF are now being called rebels, and they were tools of the state for 20 years,
Yeah.
and they're kind of using that to create a shared narrative with traditional rebels like South Kordofan and the Nuba Mountains. I think the point about the Nuba Mountains is what makes me really believe that the country will be fractured for a long period of time
Really?
because of how the RSF is capitalizing off of those really old, um, I wouldn't say conflicts, those old differences
Yeah.
that have never been settled. We have never had, in my opinion, seriously productive mediation in Sudan, grassroots mediation, community level mediation that then forces the rebel leaders at the top to then have to say, okay, well, my community wants us all to kind of be in harmony. It's never worked. I felt like when I read about these peace agreements and I look into these peace agreements, they all seem so technical, but not existential, like not actually the kind of like real heart to heart mediation that's required in these communities. And I think that is what makes me, I don't want to say resign, but makes me like question whether we will actually stay intact. Especially
Yeah.
because people on the ground in the Nuba Mountains, they have no choice right now. They don't want to be a part of the country, the military state, because they've been terrorized by them. The RSF is terrorizing them as well. But at this point, their leadership has decided that that's the partnership that he wants. And so the lack of even any sort of referendum or any,
Yeah.
political will is
Yeah.
really hard.
Wow. 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 Um, Another question. Well, this person is wondering, what are your thoughts on the motivations of the Gulf Arabs in supporting opposing sides? Is there any element of favoring the more sort of, as we were talking about, the RSF or the groups that are more aligned with Arab groups?
I believe that it is commercial. And we've been told, we interviewed an RSF intelligence officer who told us, I asked, is the UAE supporting the RSF because of any mutual ideology? And he said the relationship is purely a trade relationship.
Yeah.
So I think the Saudis kind of betting on the state makes sense to me because they have always kind of banked on al-Bashir, and they've always kind of had a pretty good relationship with al-Bashir. And it's had its kind of ebbs and flows, but I think generally they want, in this case, they want there to be enough peace for their investments to continue, whereas the UAE, it feels like they're going for a land grab
Mm,
approach. And
mm,
they're doing that in the DRC, they're doing that in Libya, they're doing that where they're basically kind of backing separatist military guys who then can kind of funnel resources to them. So I don't think the Gulf states are aligned in any way. I think that, Saudi has taken almost like a state to state approach,
Mm,
whereas the UAE is going for like a non-state actor that essentially is creating a pseudo state. But I do believe that fundamentally all of their interests are commercial.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. From Asmat, she said, "Thank you for your brilliant insights. What advice do you have for students and younger reporters who are earlier in their journeys covering conflict with the rigor, compassion, and ethics that you do?"
I think mentorship is key.
Mm,
And I think it's really important that we find mentors who, one, have experience,
mhm.
two, have compassion, who are human beings, but three, are honest, that push us and tell us when we are missing the mark. I think what's so interesting about like the arrogance of youth, or like the ignorance that we have that we hopefully shed as we get older is that you don't actually know you're blind, right? You don't
Right.
know what you can't see. And so I think it's really important to just have to like for young people to lean into um, a generation who has been through their own, crises and have seen some of the original roots of the problems that we're seeing now. And I think especially when it comes to neutrality and ethics, I think it's very easy for us uh, to become activists in this kind of social media age. And I think that for me, I really have to rein that in. And I was lucky when I was at Channel 4 News, where my editor, the foreign editor, Lilian Landor, was very, very good with telling me, stop using hashtags online, you're not an activist. And I'm like, but the revolution. So, and then you kind of, you feel like you're being suppressed, but then you realize, oh, this is for my own credibility. This is for my own restraint. This is for me to be able to not get sucked in to all of these really intense emotions that will mess with my clarity. And my mentor, Rohini Ralbi, still is always on me about that kind of penchant for activism that is so tempting. It's really tempting for me to sit here, Alexis, and be like, the West have done nothing, you know?
Totally, totally.
Yeah, like this is an abomination. It's so tempting for me to do that. And the revolution is alive. But the reality is that when has there been successful intervention? Rwanda was not successful. I mean, I was an intern when I went to Rwanda when Bill Clinton gave an apology to the Rwandans for not successfully intervening in the genocide. I just there has never really been successful interventionism
Sure.
especially in Africa. So
Exactly.
it's so important for me to then have that perspective of people who've seen, these patterns for decades and be like, wait, who are we really banking on? And it's the community, it's each other. And how is the reporting going to uplift, and serve that the community essentially, rather than kind of plead, with the begging bowl and be like, please help us. It's not going to work. It never has.
Yes, it's as you said, preserving it for the record, having it, in the archive. And yeah, I think that's such a great advice, seeking mentorship, seeking guidance, seeking your elders. We're around for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, another quick follow-up. Did you see that Atlantic cover story that this is quote unquote a war about nothing? What do you think about that?
I read it and I understood that it was about kind of the end of neoliberalism, right? And
Mm,
interventionism essentially. But I think I saw The Continent did a really great piece, The War About Everything. And
mm, mm,
I'm not even trying to be like, oh, I'm so moderate. I think it's both. I think it is a war about nothing in its futility, in
mm,
its, the fact that people don't even know why these two security partners just decided overnight that they wanted to battle it out. We were looking at them both as, it was a head of state and a VP in a post-revolution power vacuum. And overnight, it almost felt like they had a falling out, but it was really because it was a consolidation of power. So there is that war about nothing, even on a domestic level of like, what is the point of this? Like,
Yeah.
why did this have to happen? But then it's a war about everything because it's everyone wants a piece of the pie. So many people are scrambling. It is a scramble for Sudan right now in a really scary way. I don't know if you saw Russia is finally, finalizing the Red Sea naval base deal
Okay.
with the Sudanese army for fighter jets. That deal is from 2017 with Omar al-Bashir. And it was revived by the military when the war broke out because they wanted to kind of get more and more. They wanted Wagner to stop supporting the RSF, and they wanted more and more weapons from Russia. And then eventually, just in the last month, Russia kind of was like, we're done. We don't even want this Red Sea base. And then now they're moving to finalize for fighter jets. So it is about everything. It's going to
Mm.
affect everyone. So
Yeah.
I definitely I hold both.
Yeah.
There's definitely a futility and a completely unnecessary brutality.
Yes. But as you said, that there is definitely material gains for a lot of the people
Yeah.
involved. Our last question from Amran, she said, "Thank you, Yousra. This is very insightful. What signals are you watching for most closely that might indicate a shift, either towards resolution or escalation?"
For me, the Al-Fashir was the biggest shift.
Yeah.
And that's why we were all kind of working so hard to kind of ring the bell. Um, and the gains that we've seen after. So the fall of Al-Fashir has basically opened up a airport for RSF weapon supply, has opened up easier routes for arms to come in through Libya. And also it is their kind of long coveted prize. The RSF are from North Darfur. Hemedti is from North Darfur. This is like it's a city 100 years older than Khartoum. It's like it's the center of a sultanate, right? It's that for me was like they at the very least will take that forward and they will have had enough. They will get enough of what their needs are, right? So that for me was a huge kind of like, okay, an inevitable split. Um, in terms of resolution, I think the fact that the RSF is continuing to push inwards and to try and get as much of West Kordofan and North Kordofan as they can definitely signifies for me that al-Fashir isn't enough. And if anything, it's revived the war effort for them. And also the army, having lost al-Fashir, now has to prove that they aren't, you know, I wouldn't say dead weight, but that they are the necessary saviors that they've been positioning themselves to be in this war, right? When we actually, our own reporting revealed that senior commanders abandoned command, including the governor of North Darfur, and left civilians and junior officers to their fate in the early hours before the garrison fell. So there's a lot for the army now to prove. So in terms of resolution, I think the one thing that will ever make me believe in a ceasefire or resolution is if the guns stop. We've seen the Jeddah peace agreement. There wasn't any lull in fighting on the ground. We saw so many close moments where it was like, is there going to be a ceasefire? 2.5 years without a ceasefire is nuts. It's really nuts. It's the relentlessness of this war. And so I don't know if I will believe in resolution until I see it for myself.
Yeah. Fair.
Sorry, so bleak. Super. It's just I
No.
just have to be honest. Yeah.
No, but realistic. And but in the interim, as you have been doing, it is, continuing to tell these stories of people on the ground and how they're managing and coping and, supporting each other through it, which is the stories we need through the political failures. So yeah, we thank you so much, Yousra, for being here and for talking about your journey and your work. And we'll keep watching and reading and following.
Thank you
Um,
so much.
yeah, we really
So
appreciate you
much.
having here. And I know the audience is too. Everyone's saying thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll let you go.